thank you for tuning in for our latest episode of Better Humans at Work. I am thrilled to be joined today by a fellow published author and DEI practitioner, Grant Harris, who is an MBA and a certified diversity executive. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Grant.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to hang out with Dr. V. Awesome to be here.
So Grant and I have been having some really great conversations lately about DEI as a field broadly and the work we do. And I just thought it'd be great to have him on the show to hear a little bit about the work that he does. And so Grant, how did you get involved in the space? How did you become a DEI practitioner?
Oh, great question. I guess that goes to what I like to call my origin story, where it all began, so to speak. I can tell you, I did not go to school for anything DEI related. That came much later in terms of my education surrounding DEI. But I am a military school grad. I studied psychology in my undergrad. I was a philosophy minor. I'm a reader, writer, thinker at heart. I like to think about my thinking. I always like to say that. And my graduate work was in organizational psychology and development and educational leadership and administration. So you could say that some of those things have DEI related principles, but it was never part of my formal schooling that I'm aware of or that I recall. However, my lived experience as a Black man in America, certain age, my disability before my disability status before and after my diagnosis, living in a college educated family, being a homeowner, being in a multicultural relationship. My wife is Middle Eastern. Some of my kids look like me and some of them don't. So having some of that lived experience has aided in my DEI work. On top of that, that's from the personal perspective. I spent time as a special educator in a majority minority English as a second language, free and reduced lunch, low income environment, teaching autistic kids and behaviorally challenged kids, as they called it at the time. So I was in that environment, and when I flipped it, that was before I had my diagnosis. So I was teaching autistic kids before I knew I was autistic in the most restrictive environments, meaning that these kids stayed in the same room for most of the day. They didn't transition. Uh, we're working on social skills. I taught English at the time, but also working through ABA protocols and therapy with autistic kids and etc. And that's what I knew at the time before my diagnosis. So, and throughout my time in education, throughout my time in government contracting, I have always volunteered for informal roles that were DEI related, that put me in a position to talk about these topics, not necessarily from a position of education or esteem, because again, at that point, I hadn't done any of that. But just from lived experience and saying, hey, this is probably the way that these people should be treated. We should treat them a certain way, and we should be thinking a certain way, not stuck in one type of thinking. Uh, so those inherent principles were there. And then through education, being a teacher, of course, you have to go through several required courses, and being in special education, um, you get a different perspective. Not always one that I agree with in terms of how education in this country is handled, but at least you get some type of introduction to those concepts. So that's how it came to be. And then past that, I certainly have taken a deep dive into earning certifications and certificates and hanging out with people like you, reading books like yours. And all of that has been formal education as well. So nothing that was definitely didn't grow up in a family that was civil rights focused and social justice focused. My father actually participated in some of those opportunities when he was in his younger years in college. He participated in sit-ins, and he actually took me to the Million Man March way back in the day. So I had some introductory experiences with that life, but it was never something that was um, forced upon me in terms of this is the way you should go in life. But my parents obviously were attuned to being Black Americans at the time that they grew up in Jim Crow era, etc. So they had that experience and they spoke from that experience. So that was around me. But like I say, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as we know it now and as you know it now, was not part of my formal education. A lot of it was lived experience up until the last several years when I've taken an opportunity to be more formally educated.
Okay, so I want to hear a little bit more about that formal education, but before I do, I want to talk about the lived experience because you brought that up a lot. So first off, thank you for first acknowledging your own journey with your own diagnosis and how that's fed into like your DEI career trajectory. Because that's so important for calling out and acknowledgement and being a role model in this space is critical for starting to dispel the stigma. And I feel like now more than ever, we can start breaking down these barriers that have existed for so many generations. So first off, just thank you for that. But I wanted to ask you how critical, how necessary, maybe that's the better word, how necessary do you think lived experience is to being an effective DEI practitioner?
This is my personal point of view, personal perspective. I don't lay my personal opinions on anyone else. I think having a lived experience and not just having it because we all have lived experience.
Yes.
We're all here. We're all living a certain way. So it's not just having that experience. It's well, let me first say that I believe recognizing and grappling with and accepting your lived experience is more important than just having formalized DEI experience, whether it be a degree, certification, certificate, etc. I think it's more important. However, it has to be recognized. It has to be addressed. It has to be sat with. It has to be spoken about. You have to do something with it. We all have a lived experience, but if you do nothing with it, then that doesn't matter. And if you do nothing with that lived experience, anything that you would learn in a book or a classroom uh, is irrelevant because you can't marry it up with what happens in the real world. So having lived experience and addressing it and accepting it and understanding it and dealing with it from an active perspective, from a growth mindset perspective, I think is much more important than what anything that I have learned in a book or a course. Both, it's like a kingdom. You have king and queen. Lived experience is king, and queen is all the education, and you have to marry them together in order to bring a thread of, well, this is what I've seen and what I've lived, but this is how it relates to studies. This is how it relates to research. This is how it relates to practice in day to day from a practitioner standpoint, etc. And then you marry them both, and you have to balance them day in and day out. How am I balancing this? Some situations are all based on my lived experience. This is what I saw. This is what I felt. This is who I am at this moment. Other situations are all based on that formalized education. Well, this is how you address this particular topic or subject, either through a facilitation or a workshop or a courageous conversation. You set that structure up and you walk through that. And other times you have to do both, which is why being in the work that you and I are in is so taxing, so difficult emotionally, psychologically, physically. Sometimes a lot of people feel it physically. I don't. I feel it psychologically more than anything else. But while it's difficult, that's also why it's extremely rewarding, is because you get to feel the human experience And I happen to be autistic. I'm not the most empathetic person on the planet. My wife will tell you that. But I understand the need for other people to have that connection. And I get it in my own way by doing things like this and having conversations like these. This is my human interaction and connection that I go after. So hopefully that answers your question, but I feel like lived experience is more important than any formalized education, but you have to do something with that lived experience. You can't just have it and not correlate it or not compare and contrast it or not have a juxtaposition against my own or your own and then say, well, how does it relate to other people? What's my position in the world? Yeah.
So I agree with everything you're saying, and especially the fact we all have our own, unique lived experience. But do you feel like the more marginalized identities to which one belongs, the better of a DEI practitioner they can be, assuming they also have like good, educational and, professional grounding as well, holding those other variables constant?
Yeah, I got to say no. Just because you are part of a marginalized group, whatever that happens to be, does not make you an expert on that marginalized group and does not give you the mindset or the skill set to interpret your own portion of being part of that marginalized group, much less the other people around you. So just being part of a marginalized group, in my opinion, does not make that person or that group the spokesperson or an expert on the experiences of the totality of that particular group. I do think that being part of a marginalized group gives you a specialized personal experience that is different than the majority, and thereby you have specialized personal experience that you can speak to that's different than the majority, and that's helpful.
Yeah.
But again, unless you turn that and you are self-reflective, and then you compare and contrast and you intentionally put yourself in a position to see the other side, whatever that other side is, and have conversations with the non-marginalized group and to put yourself in those positions, because we all have biases. People are part of a marginalized group. They still have biases that they have to deal with. They still have prejudices that they have to work through. So while it gives them a specialized experience, I do not believe that just because you're part of that group, that somehow is going to make you a better DEI practitioner at some point in time. But that's my personal belief.
Well, and that's where we get into tokenization, right? Like I have such a bad poker face because you just hit a chord with me and I lit up because you just hit. It's where we get into tokenization, and we need to get away from that and still acknowledge as you nailed it, like the value of lived experience, but there's so much more to the equation. There's so many more competencies that we need to look for whenever it comes to what a good DEI practitioner, a good DEI leader needs to bring to the table. And you've talked to a lot of the, the burnout that happens, a lot of the toll that DEI practitioners face. But I want to pivot just a little bit. I knew we would be bumping up against time because we have such good conversations, Grant. And also for those tuning in live, I see a number of people tuning in live. If you have any questions for Grant while you're live on the call, please take advantage of that. Put this in the chat. We can ask them live on the call. But you recently wrote a book. Congratulations on that. What a huge feat. Can you tell us about the book, any key models in the book that are really pertinent to, to the framework of the book? Like what key lessons learned? Like tell us about that process. What are some key highlights of the book that you'd be willing to share with our listeners out there?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the opportunity. One, I gotta give a shout out to you because you were a little bit of inspiration along the way. Because I said, hey, look, Dr. V's doing it. Your book is awesome, and I always want to give you props where props are due. So anyone that I've spoken to or anyone that knows anything about me becoming an author, the first thing I say is I had no intention on becoming an author. That was not part of the plan. I'm a planner. Strategic planning is my thing. I'm always looking down the line, but being an author was not part of that, which I believe blessings come in unexpected packages. So, long story short, I was doing my DEI work. I was looking to expand my writing opportunities, expand writing skills. I got connected with a client. The client was looking to do a writing project. Lo and behold, it happened to be a book. And she was like, "Oh, I want a ghostwriter." And I was like, "I've never done that before, but I can write about this stuff." And in conversation, much like you and I are having, she was like, "Yeah, you should take over this and I'll publish it and I'll handle all of that. But like, you should be the author of this book in this series." Never thought about it before. Talked about it with my wife. Said, "Hey, I have an opportunity to do more with this, to do more with this conversation, to do more with this process of learning and on this journey." And at the end of the day, the worst thing that could happen is I write a handful of books and none of them sell. That's the worst thing that could happen. The best thing that can happen is I write a handful of books, and not only do they sell, but they put me in position to have conversations with people like you and the audience that you have, and build a network and be 1% better, which I'm always talking about. The upside was much greater than the downside, but I had no intention on becoming an author. But as anyone knows about me, when I make a plan and I decide to do something, I do that thing like 100%. So I decided to do it, doing it 100%. My autistic qualities have been helpful in terms of writing this book. Uh, Overall, the ethos is that there's a series of five and they're focused on workplace culture. They all have a focus. The first is DEI related frameworks, talk about accountability, talk about process and procedure. It's a foundational. It's really for three different types of reader. One is the organizational leader that is aware of diversity, equity, inclusion principles, but doesn't have the tool set or the roadmap in order to achieve the level of excellence that they're looking for. Maybe they tried something in the past and it just faltered and they didn't know how to pick up the pieces. Maybe they don't know where to start. Maybe they're in the middle of an initiative and they get stuck in the mud. And how do I move on from this? So that's one person. And the other is the DEI practitioner. Now, some practitioners have 20, 30, some odd years experience. This book is not for them. They've kind of been there and done that. It's for the newer practitioner that's getting into the field, that has some type of lived experience and or some type of education, but they either are getting started with their clientele, getting started with where they are in the organization that they sit. And again, they need that roadmap. How do I get to the next step? And the third audience for this book is the younger generation, college students. I've had the pleasure of speaking about inclusive leadership, which is number 3 in the series of books, to college students. I've had the opportunity to speak to grad students about implicit and unconscious bias. So the student is the third reader of this book. How can I apply this as I move forward in my career trajectory? So those are the 3 audiences that this book is for. The key tenets, and as you probably have heard me say, first and foremost, I talk about from moving from compliance to community. And compliance is a fixed mindset. It's focused on checking the box. It's focused on quotas. It's focused on what I like to call CYA, cover your ass. From an organizational perspective, we do what we have to because it's the law and it's the regulation, and we toe the line. However, that does not achieve excellence. What achieves excellence is moving to community, which is about a growth mindset, which is about inclusive behaviors and actions. What do you do? Policy, practice, procedure, all of those things have to be in tune in order to achieve excellence. So I'm always talking about moving from this compliance mindset that's very focused on individuality, very focused on I and me, moving to a community which is focused on we and us. How do we lift each other up? How do we include each other in every aspect of the business? And also talking about neurodiversity. in encouraging it and promoting it from what I like to call the boardroom to the mailroom. That's every aspect of the organization. I can throw out a lot of stats in terms of how CEOs identify as neurodiverse, and a majority of them do. However, in private they do, but in public they don't talk about it. Or the stats that how many neurodiverse people are on the planet, anywhere from 10 to 20% of the global population, or the fact that neurodiverse folks have a high rate of unemployment, upwards of 20% across the diaspora of neurodiversity, but autistic people like myself have an 80% unemployment rate. So these types of things I talk about and I promote and encourage with leaders throughout an organization. And this is part of the principles of the foundation of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thank you for that question, Dr. V. That's kind of the setup of the book, where it came from, where it's going. Implicit bias or unconscious bias is number 2 in the series. And fortunately, I've had the opportunity to have conversations about the principles and how people in that subset of people that I described can use it in their day-to-day operations.
Hmm. So I recognize we're already up against time, and I know you have a whole.
Oh yeah, my fault. That's my fault. That's
No,
my fault.
I mean, you wrote a whole book, so it makes sense. It makes sense. But if you could whittle it down to 3 key takeaways for listeners out there, how they can unlock the power of DEI at their organizations, what would be those 3 key takeaways you would share with our audience?
Yeah. So number 1, diversity, equity, and inclusion is it is a verb. It is not a noun. It is not a thing that you do in a moment in time. It is a process. It is a journey. It is a set of behaviors. It's a mindset. So it's a verb. It's not a noun. And they are separate in and of themselves. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are separate in and of themselves. They get grouped together quite often, but they all need to go together in order to achieve a level of excellence. So that's number 1, that it is not a thing that you do in a moment in time. It is a process and it is a journey that you build to excellence over time. Number 2 would be accountability. A lot of people throw out, "Oh, we do DEI," when you can't do DEI. It's that's again going back to the noun thing, but accountability. Who does what by when? I'm always talking about that with my client. Who does what by when? There's always a who. So who's responsible? And then what are we doing? And when are we doing it by? And then therefore you get a result and you can measure that result. Yep. So accountability is the second thing that always ask those questions. And that's the question that I ask. And I work with organizational leaders. Who does what by when? Who does what by when? Okay, you're doing it. That means you're responsible. What are you doing? And when are you doing it by? Because there has to be something tangible at the end of the day that people can take a hold of and say, okay, we got here. So how do we get to the next step? And number 3 would be a focus. I like to work in threes. So this work in the culmination of the book, again, I talked about from compliance to community, but as a reader and as an audience member, being effective and being efficient and being equitable is something to keep in mind as you do this work day in and day out. Whether you're a leader or whether you're a practitioner or whether you are learning about this work, how can you be effective and efficient and also equitable in what you apply? That takes time to kind of figure that out. You have to work through it, these kind of things. But those are 3 takeaways that from the book that I think that I describe in the book. 1, that it's a process and a journey, and it's not just a thing in time. 2, that there needs to be accountability, which is, who does what by when. And number 3, whoever is reading the book, those 3 subsets of people, when you are applying the principles, try to do so effectively. Is it actually working? Is what I'm doing working? Efficiently, is it the best use of time, talent, and treasure? And is it equitable? is it equitable for the people that are involved, not just internally, but also externally? And is it equitable for the people that anyone that touches your brand, anyone that touches the work that you do? So those three things come to mind when you ask about some key takeaways from the book.
Thank you so much, Grant, for sharing your wisdom with us. I'm so grateful that you are doing this work in the field. I shared the link where people can get in touch with you in the caption. If y'all are watching the replay of this video, you can check that out in the caption notes. Thank you so much for all that you do to help us be better humans at work.
Thank you, because you are an awesome human. I appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation with you anytime, and more so to have a conversation with your audience and with your listeners. It was great. Thank you so much.